Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where shadows stretch longer than the daylight and the quiet of the wild seems alive. Tonight, we're heading to Alaska, a land of endless winter nights, forgotten mining towns, and dark forests where the cold feels like it's watching you. These aren't campfire stories. They're true accounts, local legends, and first-hand encounters gathered from people who swore they'd never speak of them again. As we step into this frozen frontier together, remember, every sound carries farther in the cold, and sometimes, something might be listening back. Before we begin, make sure you've subscribed and tapped the bell. You don't want to miss what lurks in the next whisper. Now, pull your coat tight. The story begins here, where the ice holds secrets older than memory. Story 1. Ghost blimp of Lad Airfield. The radio crackled to life at exactly 3:17 a.m. with a transmission that shouldn't have existed. A Navy blimp requesting permission to land at Lad Airfield, using call signs that had been retired since World War II. The voice was calm, professional, speaking through static that sounded like it was traveling across decades instead of miles. My name is Robert Hansen, and I am the night shift supervisor at what used to be Lad Army Airfield in Fairbanks, Alaska. These days, it is mostly a cargo hub and emergency landing strip, but during the war it was one of the most important military bases in the North Pacific. That history came back to haunt us on a February night when the temperature hit 60 below and something impossible descended from the darkness above. I'd been working the tower for 15 years without seeing anything stranger than the occasional aurora borealis reflecting off aircraft wings. But that night, radar picked up a contact moving south from the Arctic Ocean at speeds that didn't match any known aircraft. Slow, steady, following flight patterns that hadn't been used since the 1940s. When I tried to raise the pilot on emergency frequencies, the response chilled my blood. The voice identified itself as Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell aboard Navy blimp L8, requesting immediate landing clearance for a routine patrol mission. But L8 was the designation of a blimp that had vanished over the Pacific in 1942, along with its two-man crew. I knew this because I studied every aircraft mystery in Alaska during my 20-year career in air traffic control. Ghost planes, phantom flights, aircraft that showed up on radar decades after crashing. Through my binoculars, I watched something massive and impossible drift toward the runway. A Navy blimp from World War II, its silver skin gleaming under the runway lights, moving with the kind of precision that only comes from experienced military pilots. But as it touched down with barely a whisper, I realized something was terribly wrong. The gondola windows were dark. No movement inside the cabin. No crew visible in the pilot seats. I called security and emergency response, then grabbed my flashlight and headed across the tarmac. The blimp sat perfectly positioned on the runway, its engine still humming with that distinctive sound of wartime aircraft. But when I approached the gondola and peered through the windows, my flashlight beam revealed an interior that defied explanation. The cockpit contained two flight suits, still warm, positioned in the pilot and co-pilot seats exactly as if two men had just stepped out for a coffee break. Navigation charts were spread across the control panel, showing flight routes over the Bering Sea dated February 23, 1943. Coffee cups sat half empty on instrument panels. A cigarette burned in an ashtray, its ash perfectly cylindrical, as if it had been lit moments before. But no crew, no bodies, no sign of what had happened to the two men who had guided this aircraft across 70 years of impossible flight to land at our airfield with mathematical precision. The only evidence of their existence was the lingering warmth in their seats and the phantom radio transmission that had brought them home. Security arrived 20 minutes later, followed by military investigators who seemed far too prepared for something this unusual. They cordoned off the blimp, classified the entire incident, and began asking questions that suggested this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. But they couldn't explain the logbook entries that continued appearing in the cockpit, written in handwriting that grew fainter with each passing hour. The entries told a story that made my hands shake as I read them. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell and Petty Officer Rodriguez had been conducting anti-submarine patrols off the Aleutian Islands when they encountered something that shouldn't have existed. A massive craft beneath the ice, visible through breaks in the Arctic pack, emitting signals that interfered with their navigation equipment and radio communications. According to the log entries, they had attempted to report their discovery to Naval Command but received orders to investigate further. The craft beneath the ice was unlike anything in military databases, suggesting technology that predated human civilization. As they descended for a closer look, their instruments began malfunctioning. Time seemed to distort, and the world around them started changing in ways that defied physical laws. The final entry, written in handwriting so faint it was barely visible, described their realization that they were no longer flying over the Pacific Ocean in 1943. They had somehow been transported through time and space, their aircraft preserved in a temporal bubble that had finally burst over Lad Airfield 70 years later. But the crew themselves had become something else, something that could pilot aircraft but no longer existed in any physical sense. Military investigators removed the blimp before dawn, along with every piece of evidence that it had ever landed at our airfield. They told me the incident was classified under national security protocols and that discussing it with anyone would result in federal prosecution. But they couldn't remove my memories. They couldn't erase the radio transmission I de-recorded or the photographs I de-taken before they arrived. What bothers me most, I assent to the impossibility of what I witnessed. It's the growing certainty that this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the following weeks, I began researching similar reports from military bases across Alaska. Aircraft arriving decades after they vanished, piloted by crews who were no longer technically alive. Radar contacts that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Radio transmissions from call signs that belonged to long-dead pilots. The pattern was always the same. World War II-era aircraft appearing at remote airfields, landing with precision that suggested experienced pilots, but containing no living crew members. Just warm seats, recent coffee, and navigation equipment showing impossible dates. As if somewhere in the vast emptiness between Alaska and the Arctic Circle, time itself had become unstable. I started monitoring radio frequencies that hadn't been used since the war, listening for transmissions that might provide answers to questions I was afraid to ask. What I discovered was a constant stream of phantom communications. Pilots reporting encounters with unidentified craft beneath the ice, receiving orders from command centers that no longer existed, describing phenomena that challenged everything we understand about reality. The voices were always calm, professional, following military protocols from an era when the world was at war and the Arctic was humanity's final frontier. But beneath their composed reports, I detected something else. Fear, growing awareness that they were trapped in something beyond human comprehension. Recognition that they had become part of Alaska's greatest mystery. 3 months after the blimp incident, I received a transmission on an old military frequency that made me question my own sanity. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, reporting successful completion of patrol mission and requesting permission to return to base. When I responded, asking for his current position, the silence stretched for nearly a minute before his reply came through static that sounded like wind across frozen tundra. He told me they were still flying, still searching for a way home that led somewhere other than empty runways and abandoned airfields. The craft they encountered beneath the ice had changed them, transformed them into something that existed between dimensions, capable of piloting aircraft through time but never able to land in the world they left behind. They were doomed to repeat their final mission forever, guided by navigation equipment that showed dates spanning decades. The transmission ended with a request that still haunts me. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell asked me to tell their families that they were still serving, still protecting American airspace from threats beyond human understanding. But their families had died decades ago, their names carved on memorial walls commemorating those lost in service to a war that ended before I was born. Since that night, they've become the unofficial keeper of Alaska's phantom flight records. Military personnel contact me privately, sharing reports they can file through official channels. Radar operators describing impossible aircraft. Tower controllers receiving transmissions from dead pilots. Security guards photographing empty cockpits in aircraft that shouldn't exist. The pattern is always expanding, as if whatever lies beneath the Arctic ice is calling more aircraft into its temporal web. Transport planes, fighters, bombers, all from the World War II era. All arriving at remote airfields with no crew aboard. Each incident is classified, buried in files that will never see public release. Each witness is warned to remain silent about events that officially never happened. But I can remain silent. Not when I know that somewhere above the frozen wasteland of northern Alaska, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell and Petty Officer Rodriguez are still flying their impossible mission. Still searching for coordinates that will lead them home to a world that no longer exists. Still guided by instruments that show dates from a war they can never escape. Tonight, As Aurora Borealis paints green fire across the winter sky, I'm monitoring those old military frequencies one last time, waiting for transmissions from pilots who died before my grandfather was born, listening for reports from aircraft that exist in the space between seconds, between heartbeats, between the moments when reality becomes something stranger than any fiction. And sometimes, when the static clears and the northern lights pulse with their otherworldly rhythm, I hear them. Voices from the deep cold, reporting encounters with things that shouldn't exist, following orders from commanders who died 70 years ago. Still flying, still serving, still lost somewhere between the world they knew and the mystery that claimed them. The ghost blimp of Lad Airfield was just the beginning. Whatever lies beneath the Arctic ice is still calling aircraft into its temporal maze, still collecting pilots and crew members for purposes that remain beyond human understanding. And somewhere in that frozen wasteland where time itself becomes unstable, the greatest mysteries of Alaska continue their eternal flight through skies that exist outside of history. Story 2. Screams from the Whittier tunnel. The screaming started at mile marker 2, echoing from somewhere deep inside the mountain walls. And by the time I reached mile marker 3, I knew the sounds weren't coming from any human throat. They were coming from the tunnel itself, from something trapped in the darkness between Portage and Whittier that had been waiting decades for someone to hear its call. My name is Mike Sullivan, and I drive freight through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel every week. 2.5 miles of railroad tunnel carved through Maynard Mountain, the longest combined vehicle rail tunnel in North America. Most drivers hate it, the claustrophobia, the single lane that forces you to wait for oncoming traffic, the way your headlights seem to disappear into darkness that swallows light like a hungry mouth. But I never minded the tunnel. At least, I never minded it until 3 weeks ago, when I started seeing things in my rearview mirror that shouldn't exist. Shadows moving between the support beams when no other vehicles were behind me. Faces pressed against the tunnel walls, their mouths open in silent screams that I could somehow hear despite my windows being closed and my radio playing at full volume. The Anton Anderson Tunnel has a reputation among Alaska drivers. Built in 1943 as a railroad passage, it wasn't open to vehicles until 2000. During construction, 7 workers died in cave-ins and accidents that the official records blame on unstable geology and wartime construction shortcuts. But local stories tell a different version. Stories about workers who went missing in unexplored sections of the mountain. Their bodies never recovered. Their voices still echoing in chambers that were sealed up and forgotten. What the story's done to mention is how the tunnel seems to remember every soul that died inside its walls. How the darkness between the entrance portals holds more than just absence of light. How the mountain itself has developed a hunger for human presence that grows stronger with each passing year, fed by the thousands of vehicles that travel through its belly every month. The first time I heard the screaming, I thought it was brake noise echoing off the tunnel walls. A high-pitched shriek that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing between the concrete surfaces until it became impossible to locate the source. But brakes don't sound like that. Brakes don't carry the kind of desperate agony that makes your skin crawl and your hands shake on the steering wheel. I pulled over in one of the emergency alcoves, cut my engine, and listened to the silence that filled the tunnel when no traffic was moving through. That's when I realized the screaming wasn't stopping. It was constant, a background chorus of voices that had been there all along, masked by engine noise and radio static. Voices that spoke in languages I didn't recognize, crying out from somewhere deep in the mountain where no human should be able to survive. The official explanation for the tunnel's acoustic properties is simple. The enclosed space creates unusual sound reflection patterns. Vehicle exhaust systems echo in unexpected ways. Wind moving through the ventilation system produces noises that can sound almost human. But I've been driving trucks for 25 years, and I know the difference between mechanical noise and something organic. Something alive, or at least something that used to be alive. That night, I called the tunnel's operations center to report what I experienced. The duty officer listened politely, then told me that drivers regularly report unusual sounds in the tunnel. Acoustic illusions caused by the unique environment. Nothing to worry about, just the mountain playing tricks on human perception. But his voice carried a tension that suggested he heard similar reports many times before, and those reports weren't as easily dismissed as he wanted me to believe. I started researching the tunnel's history, looking for explanations that went beyond official records and engineering reports. What I discovered was a pattern of incidents that stretched back to the original construction. Workers reporting voices calling from sealed chambers. Equipment operators finding empty hard hats and work boots in areas where no one should have been. Rescue teams searching for missing personnel and finding nothing but strange marks carved into the tunnel walls. The marks were still there, hidden in alcoves and maintenance areas where casual observers wouldn't notice them. Scratch marks that looked like fingernails dragging across concrete. Messages carved in languages that predated European settlement of Alaska. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they contained meaning that human minds weren't designed to process. Evidence of something that had been trapped in the mountain long before the first railroad crews arrived. 2 weeks ago, the screaming in my rearview mirror resolved into something worse. Faces. Human faces pressed against the rear window of my truck. Their mouths stretched wide in expressions of absolute terror. But when I turned around to look directly, nothing was there. Just the empty tunnel stretching behind me, lit by the pale glow of sodium vapor lights that seemed to dim whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. The faces belonged to the missing construction workers. I knew because I found their personnel files and archived newspaper reports from 1943. 7 men who had vanished during tunnel construction. Their disappearances officially attributed to workplace accidents and body recovery complications. But the faces I saw in my mirror showed something different. They showed men who had encountered something in the mountain that was far worse than industrial accidents. I started timing my trips to avoid being alone in the tunnel. Staying close to other vehicles, keeping my radio volume low so I could monitor the screaming that grew louder with each passage. What I discovered was that the phenomenon was escalating. Other drivers were starting to report similar experiences. Phantom passengers appearing in their back seats, hands pressing against their windows from outside, voices speaking their names through their vehicle's sound systems. The tunnel's operations center began implementing new policies without explanation. Mandatory convoy schedules to ensure no driver traveled alone. Enhanced lighting systems that somehow made the darkness seem deeper. Emergency communication protocols that required drivers to check in every quarter mile. Measures that suggested they knew something was wrong but couldn't acknowledge it officially. That is when I learned about the sealed chambers. During construction, workers had discovered natural caves extending deep into the mountain. Chambers that contained evidence of human habitation dating back thousands of years. Cave paintings that depicted something living in the heart of the mountain. Something that demanded sacrifice and offering from those who dared to disturb its domain. Military engineers had sealed those chambers during construction, filling them with concrete and marking them as classified areas on blueprints that were never released to the public. But concrete cracks under pressure. Seals deteriorate over time. And whatever had been living in those chambers for millennia was patient enough to wait for the barriers to weaken and the darkness to reclaim its territory. Last week, I made a decision that still terrifies me. Instead of rushing through the tunnel with my radio blasting, I drove slowly, windows down, listening carefully to the sounds that echoed from the mountain walls. What I heard was a conversation. Dozens of voices speaking in the darkness, calling to each other across distances that shouldn't exist within the tunnel's dimensions. Voices that included the 7 missing construction workers, but also others. Many others. The voices were discussing me, describing my truck, my route, my schedule, planning something that would happen during my next trip through the tunnel. I heard my name spoken by people who had died before I was born, pronounced with the kind of familiarity that comes from long observation. They had been watching me, studying me, preparing for the moment when I would join their eternal conversation in the darkness beneath the mountain. I should have stopped driving the tunnel route immediately. Should have requested a transfer to another area, found a different job, moved away from Alaska entirely. But I couldn't stop thinking about those voices, about the loneliness in their words, the desperate hunger for human contact that had kept them conscious long after their bodies had failed. They weren't malevolent. They were just trapped, and they wanted company in their isolation. 3 days ago, I made my final trip through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel. This time, I stopped in the center, turned off my engine, and stepped out of my truck. The screaming stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like standing inside a tomb. That is when I saw them clearly for the first time. Not reflections in mirrors or shadows in peripheral vision, but the actual figures of everyone who had ever been claimed by the mountain. They stood in the emergency alcoves, pressed against the tunnel walls, filling every space between the support beams. Hundreds of them, spanning decades of disappearances that had never been officially recorded. Construction workers, maintenance personnel, drivers who had broken down and never been found. All of them preserved in the darkness, all of them waiting for new arrivals to join their community beneath the mountain. I'm writing this from my apartment in Anchorage, but I know I want to be staying here much longer. The voices from the tunnel have followed me home. They speak through my radio, through my television, through the static on my cell phone. They recalling me back to complete what I started, to take my place in the darkness where time doesn't pass and loneliness becomes a shared experience rather than an individual burden. Tomorrow, I'll drive the tunnel one last time. Not as a freight driver following a schedule, but as someone who finally understands what the mountain has been offering all these years. Not death, but transformation. Not an ending, but a different kind of existence in the spaces between light and darkness, between sound and silence, between the world above and the eternal community that waits in the depths of Maynard Mountain. The screaming from the Whittier Tunnel ISN, to a warning. It is an invitation, and after 3 weeks of fighting the call, they decided to accept. Story 3. Kodiak bear cult murder. The claw marks on Thomas Hartley. His chest were not made by any bear that walks this earth. I know because I was the forensic investigator who examined his body in November 1997, pulled from a ritual circle deep in the Kodiak Island wilderness. What I found carved into his flesh defied everything I knew about animal attacks. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate. They spelled out symbols that belonged to no native Alaskan tradition I could identify. My name is Detective Ray Morrison, Alaska State Troopers, retired. For 23 years, I thought I had seen every kind of violence humans could inflict on each other. Remote locations breed desperate people, and Alaska has more remote locations than anywhere else in America. But the Hartley case broke something inside me that never healed. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late November. A hunting guide had found human remains near Pillar Mountain, arranged in what he described as some kind of ceremony. The body was positioned in the center of a perfect circle made from bear bones, surrounded by carved totems that looked ancient but wrong somehow. Like someone had taken traditional symbols and twisted them into something darker. Kodiak Island sits in the Gulf of Alaska like a fortress of wilderness. Home to the largest bears in the world and maybe 3,000 people spread across an area the size of Connecticut. Most folks who live there understand the island belongs to the bears, not to humans. We are visitors at best, prey at worst. Thomas Hartley had moved to Kodiak 6 months earlier from Seattle, running from a messy divorce and looking for what he called spiritual renewal. He bought a cabin 15 miles outside town and started hiking the backcountry alone, despite every local warning him about the bears. Kodiak browns can weigh 1,500 pounds and stand 10 feet tall. They fear nothing and forgive less. But Hartley was not killed by a bear. He was killed by someone who wanted us to think a bear had done it. The crime scene made my skin crawl from the moment I arrived. Hartley was positioned on his back with his arms spread wide, naked despite the freezing temperature. The claw marks on his chest formed a pattern that looked almost like writing. 4 parallel gouges, repeated across his torso in groups that suggested meaning rather than random violence. Around the body, someone had arranged dozens of bear bones in concentric circles. Not random bones from different animals, but carefully selected pieces that fit together like a puzzle. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all bleached white and positioned with mathematical precision. At the cardinal points of the outer circle stood wooden totems carved with symbols I had never seen before. The medical examiner confirmed what I suspected. The claw marks were made post-mortem with some kind of tool designed to mimic bear claws. The actual cause of death was strangulation, but there were no defensive wounds on the hands or arms. Hartley had not fought his attacker. Either he knew them or was unconscious when the killing began. The investigation led me to Marcus Koenig, a local trapper who had been living on Kodiak for 8 years. Neighbors described him as strange but harmless. He lived alone in a cabin near the Buskin River and made his living selling bear pelts to collectors in the lower 48. But when I searched his property, I found something that turned my blood cold. His cabin was a shrine to bears. Not the normal hunting trophies you might expect, but something far more disturbing. Bear skulls painted with symbols similar to those found at the crime scene. Claw necklaces arranged on makeshift altars. And books, dozens of books about shamanism, spirit animals, and native Alaskan legends that had been heavily annotated in red ink. But the most disturbing discovery was in his basement. a workshop where he had been manufacturing fake bear claws from metal and bone. Dozens of them, crafted with obsessive attention to detail and sharpened to surgical precision. When I confronted him about the tools, Koenig claimed they were for ceremonial purposes. He said the bear spirits had chosen him to preserve their ancient wisdom. The deeper I dug into Koenig, his background, the stranger the story became. He had arrived on Kodiak with no family, no friends, no connections to anyone. Just a man with enough money to buy a cabin and live off the grid. But according to shipping records, he had been receiving packages from academic sources across the country. Rare books, historical documents, anthropological studies. He was building a library of knowledge about bear worship that spanned cultures and centuries. The breakthrough came when I found his journal. Written in the same red ink he used to annotate his books, it detailed his growing obsession with what he called the Great Bear Spirit. He believed that Kodiak Island was a sacred place where the barrier between human and animal consciousness was thinnest. Through proper ritual and sacrifice, he claimed, a person could transcend human limitations and achieve bear consciousness. The journal entries became increasingly unhinged as they progressed. Koenig described dreams where bears spoke to him in ancient languages, visions of prehistoric ceremonies where humans willingly offered themselves to bear spirits, and finally, detailed plans for a ritual that would allow him to absorb the spiritual power of both bear and human through ceremonial murder. Thomas Hartley had not been chosen randomly. According to the journal, Koenig had been watching him for weeks, studying his hiking patterns and solitary nature. Hartley represented what Koenig called the perfect offering, a urban man seeking spiritual connection with wilderness, someone whose death would create a bridge between civilized and primal worlds. The ritual itself was described in disturbing detail. Koenig had lured Hartley to a remote location with promises of showing him traditional native sites. Once there, he drugged him with a sedative made from local plants, then performed what he believed was an ancient ceremony combining elements from multiple indigenous traditions. But Koenig had invented most of it. The symbols, the bone arrangements, the carved totems were his own creation, inspired by half-understood legends and academic theories. He was not preserving ancient wisdom. He was creating his own twisted mythology and using murder to make it real. When we arrested Koenig, he showed no remorse for killing Hartley. Instead, he claimed the ritual had worked exactly as intended. The bear spirits had accepted his offering and granted him their power. As proof, he pointed to his eyes, which had developed an unsettling yellow tinge that I initially attributed to jaundice or drug use. During interrogation, Koenig displayed behavior that still haunts me. He moved with an unnatural stillness, like a predator waiting to strike. His breathing was deep and slow, almost hibernatory. And when he spoke, his voice had a growling quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. Whether this was genuine psychological transformation or elaborate acting, I could never determine. The trial made national news as an example of urban isolation driving people to violence. Koenig was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The case was closed, the files sealed, and everyone involved tried to move on with their lives. But the story did not end there. 3 months after Koenig's conviction, I received a call from the Anchorage Correctional Complex. Koenig had been found dead in his cell under impossible circumstances. The cell door was locked from the outside, the walls were solid concrete, and the window was too small for human passage. Yet somehow, Koenig had been torn apart with the same precision as the fake claw marks he had made on Thomas Hartley. The official report listed the death as suicide, claiming Koenig had used improvised tools to inflict the wounds on himself. But I saw the crime scene photos. No human could have reached the angles necessary to create those cuts. And no human could have generated the force required to break ribs and puncture organs with such efficiency. The prison guards reported strange sounds from Koenig's cell block in the weeks before his death. Deep, rumbling growls that seemed to come from multiple sources. Scratching sounds in the walls. And on the night he died, they heard what sounded like a massive animal moving through corridors that were too narrow for anything larger than a man. I retired from the Alaska State Troopers 6 months after Koenig's death and moved to Arizona, as far from bear country as I could get. But the case still follows me. Sometimes, in my dreams, I am back on Kodiak Island, standing in that circle of bones while something massive moves through the trees around me. Something that walks on 2 legs but thinks with the mind of a predator. The official records show that Marcus Koenig killed Thomas Hartley in a delusional attempt to commune with bear spirits. But the truth is more complicated than that. Koenig believed he could use murder to transcend human nature. And somehow, impossibly, he might have succeeded. Whether the bears killed him for his blasphemy or accepted him into their eternal hunt, I will never know. What I do know is that some boundaries should never be crossed. Some knowledge should stay buried in the wilderness where it belongs. And some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied by human prey alone. The Kodiak bear cult murder was solved, the killer brought to justice, and the case closed. But deep in the Alaskan wilderness, where the line between civilization and savagery grows thin, the ritual continues. And somewhere in the darkness between human consciousness and animal instinct, Marcus Koenig still walks among the bears he worshipped, forever hungry for the next offering to his twisted faith. Story 4. Stampede Trail Watcher. The eyes in the tree line have been watching the Stampede Trail for 97 years, and I am the only person alive who knows why they can never look away. My name is Carl Hendricks, and I was a wilderness guide in Alaska for 31 years before what I found on that trail forced me into early retirement. This story takes place in September 2005, 8 years before Chris McCandless became famous for dying out there. But the Stampede Trail was killing people long before that young man ever heard of Alaska. I was hired by a geology team from the University of Washington to guide them along the old mining trails north of Healy. Standard job, 3 professors looking for mineral samples, plenty of gear, good weather forecast. The kind of work I had done hundreds of times without incident. But this trip was different because one of the professors had heard the stories about the Watcher. Dr. Sarah Kim was an anthropologist studying Alaska native legends, and she had interviewed dozens of old-timers who refused to hunt or trap anywhere near the Stampede Trail. They all told the same story. A figure in the tree line, always watching, never approaching. A man in old-fashioned mining clothes who appeared whenever someone ventured too far into his territory. The locals called him the Watcher, and they claimed he had been there since the 1920s. A prospector named Ezra Finn who had staked a claim somewhere along the trail and never left, even after death. According to the stories, Finn had found something valuable in those mountains. Something worth dying for. Something worth guarding forever. Dr. Kim wanted to document these stories and maybe find evidence of historical mining activity in the area. Academic research, she assured me. Nothing dangerous. Just a few days on the trail looking for old campsites and abandoned equipment. I should have trusted my instincts and turned down the job. We started our hike from the Stampede Road on a clear September morning. The trail was in good condition, and the autumn colors were spectacular. Red and gold leaves carpeted the ground, and the air had that crisp quality that makes Alaska hiking feel like walking through a postcard. For the first day, everything went perfectly. The trouble started on our second night, camped about 12 miles in near the Teklenika River. I was checking our perimeter before turning in when I saw him. A figure standing motionless in the spruce trees about 50 yards from our camp. Tall, wearing what looked like an old canvas coat and wide-brimmed hat. Too far away to see details, but close enough to know he was watching us. I called out, thinking it might be another hiker or a local hunter. No response. The figure remained perfectly still for maybe 30 seconds, then simply melted back into the trees. When I reached the spot where he had been standing, I found no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had ever been there. That night, I heard sounds I had never encountered in 3 decades of Alaska wilderness. Rhythmic tapping, like someone hammering metal against rock. The sound came from different directions throughout the night, always distant but clearly audible. Pick against stone, the unmistakable sound of mining. Dr. Kim was fascinated when I told her about the figure. She immediately connected it to the Watcher stories and insisted we search for evidence of historical mining activity. Against my better judgment, I agreed to extend our trip by 2 days. The geology team wanted more samples anyway, and the weather was holding. We found the first mine shaft on our 3rd day, hidden in a grove of birch trees about a quarter-mile off the main trail. It was old, probably dating to the 1920s based on the construction techniques. Hand-carved into solid rock, maybe 30 feet deep, with rotting timber supports that looked ready to collapse. The kind of claim a lone prospector might work for years without finding anything worthwhile. But this mine was different. The walls were covered with carved symbols that looked nothing like typical miners' marks. Spirals and interlocking circles, repeated patterns that seemed to form some kind of writing system. Dr. Kim photographed everything, excited about what she called evidence of undocumented cultural activity. At the bottom of the shaft, we found mining tools, pickaxes, shovels, pans, all in remarkably good condition despite being exposed to the elements for decades. And scattered among the tools were nuggets of what looked like gold. Not the usual flakes you might pan from a stream, but substantial pieces that would have made any prospector wealthy. The mystery deepened when we examined the gold more closely. Each nugget was carved with the same spiral symbols we had seen on the mine walls. Someone had taken the time to etch intricate patterns into pure gold, creating artifacts that were part treasure, part artwork. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, suggesting skills far beyond what you would expect from an ordinary prospector. That evening, as we camped near the mine site, the Watcher appeared again. This time he was closer, maybe 20 yards away, standing at the edge of our firelight. I could see him clearly for the first time, and what I saw made my blood run cold. He was tall and gaunt, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged in an old Western movie. Canvas pants, leather boots, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. But it was his eyes that terrified me. They glowed with a dull yellow light, like the reflection of fire in animal eyes. And they never blinked, never moved, just stared at us with an intensity that felt like physical weight. Dr. Kim tried to approach him, calling out greetings in both English and what she claimed was an Athabascan dialect. The figure remained motionless for several minutes, then slowly raised one arm and pointed toward the mine shaft. The gesture was unmistakable. He wanted us to go back to the mine. Against every survival instinct I had developed in 30 years of guiding, we followed his direction. The Watcher led us to the mine shaft, moving through the forest with unnatural silence. His feet made no sound on the forest floor, and branches seemed to part before him without rustling. He moved like smoke given human form. At the mine entrance, he stopped and pointed down into the shaft. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see something we had missed during our earlier exploration. Carved into the rock at the very bottom was a message in English, scratched deep into the stone with desperate urgency. The gold is cursed, cannot leave, cannot stop digging. Ezra Finn, 1928. Below the message, carved symbols covered every available surface. Hundreds of spirals and circles, overlapping and intersecting in patterns that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to move in my peripheral vision, writhing like living things carved into dead stone. Dr. Kim was documenting everything with her camera when we heard the hammering again. But this time it was coming from inside the mine shaft. The sound of metal against rock, echoing up from depths that should have been empty. Someone was digging down there in the darkness, working with mechanical precision despite the late hour. I grabbed Dr. Kim and pulled her away from the mine entrance. Whatever was down there, I did not want to meet it face to face. But as we backed away, the Watcher stepped into our path. Up close, I could see that his clothes were not old-fashioned replicas. They were genuinely antique, worn and stained by decades of wear. And his face, glimpsed beneath the hat brim, was not entirely human. His skin was the color of old leather, stretched tight over bones that seemed too large for human proportions. His mouth hung open slightly, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. And his eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, held an intelligence that was completely mad. This was not a ghost or a spirit. This was something that had once been human but had become something else through years of obsession and isolation. He spoke then, and his voice was like wind through dry leaves. He told us about the gold, about the symbols, about the curse that bound him to this place. The gold was not ordinary metal but something far older, something that had been buried in the earth since before humans walked in Alaska. The symbols were not decorative but functional, each one a link in a chain that connected the physical gold to something vast and hungry sleeping beneath the mountain. Ezra Finn had found the gold in 1927 and tried to mine it like any other precious metal. But each piece he extracted made him more obsessed, more desperate to find the source. The symbols had appeared in his dreams first, then in his waking visions, finally compelling him to carve them into every surface he could reach. The more he carved, the more the thing beneath the mountains awakened. It spoke to him through the gold, promising wealth beyond imagination in exchange for service. All he had to do was keep digging, keep carving, keep feeding it with the energy of his obsession. Finn had died in 1928, but death had not released him from his bargain. He was bound to the gold, compelled to guard it from anyone who might disturb the delicate balance he had achieved through decades of torment. The hammering sounds were his ghostly mining, an eternal effort to keep the sleeping thing satisfied while preventing it from fully awakening. But our presence had disrupted that balance. By removing some of the carved gold pieces from the mine, we had weakened the bindings that kept the ancient thing dormant. It was stirring now, sensing freedom after nearly a century of imprisonment. And Finn could no longer maintain control alone. The Watcher needed our help. Not to escape his curse, but to strengthen it. To add our life energy to his eternal vigil, binding us to the gold and the mine and the terrible responsibility of keeping something monstrous asleep beneath the Alaskan wilderness. I understood then why the old-timers avoided the Stampede Trail. Why trappers and hunters found excuses to stay away from that particular stretch of forest. They had encountered the Watcher over the decades and recognized the hunger in those glowing eyes. The desperate need for company in his endless, hopeless task. We ran through the forest, back toward the main trail, leaving our equipment and Dr. Kim, his precious photographs behind. The Watcher followed us, never hurrying but never falling behind. He moved through the trees like a shadow, always visible in our peripheral vision, always watching with those terrible eyes. We made it back to the Stampede Road and drove toward Fairbanks without stopping. But I knew we had not escaped. In my rearview mirror, I could see a tall figure standing motionless beside the trail, watching our retreat with patient, eternal hunger. Dr. Kim tried to organize a return expedition, but I refused to guide it. 6 months later, she went back with a different guide. They found the mine shaft collapsed, filled with rockfall that looked like it had been there for decades. No gold, no tools, no carved symbols. Just another abandoned prospect hole in the Alaska wilderness. But the Watcher is still there, still guarding his cursed claim, still hammering in the darkness, still looking for someone desperate or foolish enough to help him carry his burden. The Stampede Trail attracts people seeking something they cannot find in civilization. Freedom, adventure, spiritual enlightenment. Most of them find only death, but some of them find something worse. They find Ezra Finn, waiting in the tree line with gold in his pockets and madness in his glowing eyes. And they learn that some treasures are too dangerous to possess, and some curses are too strong to break, even with death. The eyes in the tree line are still watching, still waiting, still hoping for the day when someone will be desperate enough to accept his offer of partnership in an eternal, hopeless task. And deep beneath the mountains, something ancient stirs in its sleep, dreaming of gold and symbols and the day when it will finally be free to walk the world again. You're still here. Good. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never lose the trail. Drop a comment with your location or your own creepy story. Alaska's whispers have a way of finding new ears. Story 5. Whispering mummies. I heard them calling my name through 6 inches of reinforced glass at 3:17 in the morning. The security cameras showed nothing but empty hallways, yet the whispers grew louder each night, speaking words in a language that had been dead for 800 years. My name is Tom Bradley, and I worked night security at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History for 11 years. What I discovered in the Native American collection during those long, dark hours changed my understanding of death, and why some things should never be disturbed from their eternal rest. The official story says the ancestral Puebloan mummies in Hall 6 are educational displays that help visitors understand ancient Southwest cultures. Preserved by the dry desert climate of Colorado and Utah, these naturally mummified remains represent families who died during the Great Drought of the 13th century. Academic research, cultural preservation, nothing more sinister than old bones and dried skin behind climate-controlled glass. But I know better now. The first incident happened during my second week on the job. I was making routine rounds through the darkened halls when my radio crackled with static that sounded almost like human speech. The transmission lasted only seconds, but I could swear I heard someone saying my name, followed by what sounded like crying. When I checked with the Central Security Office, they had no record of any radio traffic during that time. The temperature drop came next. Hall 6 maintained a constant 72 degrees for preservation purposes, monitored by sensors that triggered alarms if the climate deviated even slightly. Yet every night around 3 a.m., the temperature would plummet to near freezing for exactly 17 minutes. The sensors registered no change, but my breath would fog in the air and frost would form on the display cases. Maintenance found nothing wrong with the HVAC system. I started paying closer attention to the mummy displays during those temperature drops. There were 12 individuals in total, 2 complete family groups and several isolated remains. The museum placards described them as victims of drought and famine, but closer examination revealed details that didn't match the official narrative. Several showed signs of violent trauma that had been carefully concealed by the display positioning. Others had been bound with cordage before death, their arms and legs positioned to hide the ligature marks. The whispers began during my 4th month on the job. At first, I thought the sounds were coming from the building, its aging ventilation system. Soft sighs and rustling noises that could be explained by air moving through old ductwork. But gradually, the sounds became more distinct, more purposeful. I could make out individual voices speaking in urgent, pleading tones, as if trying to communicate something important. The acoustic analysis equipment I borrowed from the museum, its audio department registered nothing. But my human ears couldn't ignore what they were hearing. I researched the history of the mummies and discovered that their acquisition by the museum had been controversial even by early 20th century standards. They had been removed from a sealed cave system in southwestern Colorado in 1924, despite protests from local tribal communities who insisted the site was sacred ground. The excavation team reported unusual difficulties during the removal process, equipment failures, unexplained accidents, and several team members developing severe respiratory infections that left them hospitalized for weeks. The original expedition notes, buried in the museum's archives, described the cave as an artificial burial chamber that had been deliberately sealed with stones and clay. Inside, the 12 bodies were arranged in a circular pattern around a central fire pit, their hands positioned to touch each other in an unbroken chain. Carbon dating later confirmed they had died within hours of each other, but not from starvation or disease. Toxicology analysis revealed high levels of plant alkaloids in their preserved tissues, evidence of intentional poisoning. I realized I wasn't looking at drought victims or a family that had starved during hard times. These were ritual sacrifice victims, killed to appease whatever force their people believed was causing the great drought. Their bodies had been preserved not by accident, but by design, maintained in a sacred space where their spirits could continue serving their purpose for centuries. Removing them from that sealed chamber had broken whatever spiritual containment had held them in place. The whispers grew more insistent as winter approached, and I began to understand fragments of what they were trying to communicate. They spoke of hunger that could never be satisfied, a thirst that grew stronger with each passing year, of a need to complete their interrupted sacrifice. The temperature drops became more frequent and lasted longer, and I started finding evidence of their growing influence throughout the museum. Security cameras captured shadows moving independently of any light source. Motion detectors triggered in empty rooms where the temperature had dropped 40 degrees below normal. Other staff members reported feeling watched during their daytime shifts, and several complained of persistent dreams featuring drought, famine, and ritual death. The museum, its employees' sick leave requests tripled as people developed respiratory problems identical to those that had affected the original excavation team. I tried to research methods for containing or appeasing angry spirits, but the tribal communities who might have possessed that knowledge were understandably reluctant to share sacred information with someone associated with the institution that had desecrated their ancestors' graves. The few academic sources I found suggested that interrupted burial rituals could leave spirits trapped between worlds, growing more powerful and desperate with each passing year. The breakthrough came when I discovered the museum had more than just the 12 displayed mummies. Hidden in the collection storage basement were dozens of additional remains from the same site, bones, artifacts, and preserved tissue samples that had never been put on display. These included the skeleton of a 13th individual who had been found separate from the main group, positioned as if standing guard at the chamber's entrance. Unlike the others, this individual showed no signs of poisoning or violent death. Instead, the bones revealed evidence of extreme old age and what appeared to be ritual scarification covering every surface. The storage area was kept at near freezing temperatures for preservation, but the air around the 13th skeleton was warm to the touch. Electromagnetic field detectors went crazy in its presence, and digital cameras malfunctioned within a 10-foot radius. Most disturbing of all, the whispers were strongest here, coming not from the displayed mummies upstairs but from this hidden guardian who had been separated from those it was meant to protect. I understood then that the 12 mummies were not the source of the paranormal activity. They were victims trying to complete a ritual that had been interrupted by their removal from the cave. The 13th skeleton was their spiritual leader, the shaman who had overseen their sacrifice and whose job was to ensure their deaths served their intended purpose. For nearly a century, it had been trying to reunite with its charges and finish what it had started. The ritual required 13 deaths, not 12. I was the missing piece, the final sacrifice needed to complete what had begun 8 centuries ago in that sealed Colorado cave. The whispers had been calling my name because the spirits had recognized me as the person who could restore the balance, who could fulfill their ancient obligation and allow them to finally rest. The temperature drops, the electromagnetic anomalies, the growing supernatural activity throughout the museum, all of it was building toward the moment when I would join them in death and complete their interrupted purpose. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange sense of relief. For months, I had been fighting against forces I didn't understand, trying to maintain order in a situation that demanded completion. The whispers were not threats, they were invitations. The cold was not punishment, it was preparation. Everything that had seemed malevolent was actually merciful, offering me a chance to end the suffering of spirits who had been trapped in an impossible situation for far too long. I'm telling you this story because tonight is the winter solstice, and the whispers have grown so loud I can barely think. The museum is closed for the holiday, and I am alone with 13 ancient spirits who have waited nearly 100 years for someone to understand their need. The temperature in Hall 6 has dropped below freezing, and frost covers every surface despite the heating system running at full capacity. They were ready to complete their sacrifice, and I'm ready to help them find peace. If you visit the Native American collection in the years ahead, you might notice that the displays have changed slightly. There are still 12 mummies arranged in their circular pattern, but the placard will mention 13 individuals recovered from the Colorado site. The final member of the group will be positioned at the center of the circle, hands reaching out to touch the others in an unbroken chain that connects the living world to the realm of the dead. The whispers will finally be silent, and the great drought that has haunted their spirits for 8 centuries will finally end. Story 6. Thing that killed Portlock. I found the skull lodged in a tree 40 feet above ground, crushed like an eggshell between fingers too large to belong to any human being. The bone fragments still clung to bark that had grown around them over 70 years, marking the spot where Albert Petka met his end in 1943. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a wilderness photographer who spent 6 months documenting the abandoned ruins of Portlock, Alaska. What I discovered in that ghost town changed my understanding of why some places stay empty, and what happens when something ancient decides it wants human beings gone forever. The official story says Portlock was abandoned due to economic hardship after World War II. The cannery closed, jobs disappeared, and families moved to more prosperous areas. A typical tale of rural economic decline that played out across Alaska during the post-war years. The few historians who mention the town at all describe it as a minor fishing village that simply couldn't compete with larger operations. But they never mention the bodies. Portlock sits on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, a remote stretch of coastline accessible only by boat or floatplane. I chartered a flight from Homer expecting to find the usual collection of rotted buildings and rusted equipment that marked most Alaskan ghost towns. Instead, I discovered a settlement that looked like it had been evacuated in panic, with personal belongings still scattered where they had been dropped and doors left hanging open as if people had fled in the middle of daily activities. The first anomaly I noticed was the defensive structures. Portlock wasn't just abandoned. It had been fortified. Every building showed evidence of hasty reinforcement with steel plates, heavy timbers, and what appeared to be gun ports cut through exterior walls. The schoolhouse had been turned into a virtual fortress, with windows bricked up and the entrance barricaded with railroad ties. These weren't modifications made by casual vandals or scavengers. They were the desperate preparations of people under siege. I started photographing the ruins systematically, working my way from the waterfront cannery toward the residential areas higher up the hillside. The deeper I went into the town, the more disturbing the evidence became. Massive claw marks scarred the wooden siding of houses, gouged too deep and too high to have been made by any known Alaskan wildlife. Door frames were splintered outward, as if tremendous force had been applied from the outside. And everywhere I looked, I found traces of violence that told a story far different from simple economic abandonment. The local cemetery provided the first concrete evidence of what had really happened in Portlock. Headstones dating from 1931 to 1949 revealed a death rate that far exceeded what would be normal for a small fishing community. More importantly, the causes of death listed on the markers told a pattern of escalating horror. Heart failure in 1931, hunting accident in 1933, missing at sea in 1935. Then the euphemisms became more direct. Killed by wild animal, mauled beyond recognition, found in pieces. I researched the town, its history, and discovered that Portlock had been plagued by unexplained deaths and disappearances from almost the moment it was established. The native Alutiiq people had warned the original cannery operators that the area was home to something they called Mantinaq, a creature that walked like a man but possessed the strength and savagery of a demon. The warnings were dismissed as superstition, but the death toll suggested otherwise. The creature seemed to follow seasonal patterns, becoming most active during the winter months when storms isolated the community and darkness stretched across 18 hours of each day. Victims were typically found torn apart, their bodies scattered across impossible distances as if thrown by something with supernatural strength. Witnesses described a humanoid figure over 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with eyes that reflected light like those of a nocturnal predator. But Mantinaq wasn't just killing randomly. The attack patterns showed intelligence, planning, and what appeared to be deliberate psychological warfare designed to drive the human population away from its territory. The creature would stalk individual families for weeks, leaving evidence of its presence around their homes. Massive footprints in the snow, claw marks on doors and windows, and the remains of mutilated animals arranged in threatening displays. When the families finally cracked under the psychological pressure and attempted to flee, Mantinaq would hunt them down in the wilderness. The most detailed account I found was buried in the personal papers of Thomas Bay, the last postmaster of Portlock. His journal described the winter of 1943 as a siege that lasted from November through March, with the creature becoming increasingly bold in its attacks. Families barricaded themselves inside reinforced buildings while Mantinaq prowled the streets at night, testing doors and windows, and calling out in what Bay described as a grotesque imitation of human speech. Bay's final entry, dated March 15, 1949, described the morning he found Albert Petka. His remains scattered across 3 city blocks. The logger had been working alone at the edge of town when Mantinaq caught him. Bay wrote that pieces of Petka had been wedged into tree branches at heights that required superhuman strength to reach, positioned where they would be clearly visible to anyone who dared venture outside. It was the final message the creature needed to send. By summer, Portlock was empty. I spent weeks searching for Albert Petka's skull, using Bay's journal entries to narrow down the location. When I finally found it 40 feet up in an old-growth spruce, still embedded in bark that had healed around the bone fragments, I realized I was looking at evidence of a murder that had occurred over 70 years ago. The skull showed massive trauma consistent with crushing force applied by something with hands large enough to grip a human head like a baseball. But finding the skull wasn't the most disturbing part of my investigation. The most disturbing part was realizing that Mantinaq was still there. The signs were subtle at first. Fresh tracks in the mud near my campsite that were too large and too human-like to belong to any known animal. The sound of something large moving through the forest at night, always staying just outside the range of my flashlight. The feeling of being watched from the tree line whenever I worked alone in the ruins. I told myself it was paranoia, the natural result of spending too much time researching violent deaths in an isolated location. Then I found the recent kills. Hidden in a ravine behind the old schoolhouse, I discovered a collection of animal remains that had been arranged in the same threatening patterns Bay had described in his journal. Moose, caribou, and smaller game animals, all killed within the last few months and positioned to create maximum psychological impact on any human who might stumble across them. The kills were fresh enough that some still attracted scavenger birds, but arranged with a deliberate artistry that no natural predator would employ. I realized that Mantinaq had never left Portlock. It had successfully driven away the human population and claimed the territory as its own, continuing to patrol and defend its domain against any potential intruders. My presence had triggered its defensive instincts, and it was beginning the same psychological campaign that had terrorized the original residents. The creature was methodically escalating its intimidation tactics, testing my resolve and preparing for the final confrontation that would either drive me away or add my remains to its collection. The attacks began during my 5th week in Portlock. I woke one morning to find my campsite completely rearranged. My equipment had been moved but not damaged, repositioned in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random vandalism. My cameras had been turned to face specific locations: the cemetery, the schoolhouse, and the tree where Albert Petka had died. It was a message I couldn't ignore. Mantinaq knew exactly why I was there and what I had discovered. The psychological pressure intensified over the following days. I would return from photographing sessions to find massive handprints pressed into the mud around my tent, each print showing fingers that were too long and too thick to be human. My food supplies were tampered with but not stolen, contaminated with a musky scent that made them inedible. And every night, Something large circled my campsite just outside the range of my lights, occasionally producing sounds that seemed like distorted attempts at human speech. I tried to document the harassment, but my cameras malfunctioned whenever I attempted to photograph the creature directly. Digital images showed nothing but blur and static, while film exposures came out completely black despite perfect lighting conditions. Whatever Nantinaq was, it seemed to exist partially outside the spectrum of light that photographic equipment could capture. The breaking point came during a storm that trapped me in Portlock for 3 additional days. Cut off from any possibility of evacuation, I found myself in the same situation that had faced the original residents during their final winter. Nantinaq became increasingly aggressive, testing the defenses of the abandoned building where I had taken shelter and making sounds that mimicked human voices calling for help. On the second night of the storm, I heard my own name being called from the darkness outside. The voice was almost human, but wrong in ways that triggered every instinctive fear response evolution had programmed into my nervous system. It was my voice, but older, damaged, as if something had learned to imitate human speech by listening to the final screams of its victims. I understood then why Portlock had been abandoned. The creature wasn't just a predator. It was a psychological weapon that used terror as precisely as any human military strategist. Nantinaq had learned that driving people insane was more effective than simply killing them, because insane people fled and told stories that kept others away. The creature had achieved what no human army could accomplish, the complete and permanent evacuation of territory it considered its own. By the third day, I was hallucinating from sleep deprivation and stress. I saw movement in every shadow, heard voices in every sound the wind made through the ruins. My rational mind knew I was experiencing the same psychological breakdown that had driven the original residents to flee. But knowing the cause didn't make the terror any less real. Nantinaq had refined its methods over decades of practice, and it knew exactly how to push human psychology past the breaking point. When the storm finally cleared, I packed my equipment as quickly as possible and called for emergency evacuation. The pilot who picked me up commented that I looked like I had seen a ghost, but I couldn't explain what had really happened without sounding insane. How do you tell someone that they encountered a creature that exists outside normal reality? Something that has spent over 70 years perfecting the art of psychological warfare against the human species. I am telling you this story because Nantinaq is still out there, still defending the territory it claimed when it drove the last humans from Portlock. The creature has learned that fear is more powerful than violence, that the threat of death is often more effective than death itself. It has created a 40-square-mile exclusion zone where human beings are not welcome, and it maintains that boundary through methods that would make military psychologists envious. If you were planning to explore Alaska's abandoned places, stay away from Portlock. The economic explanations for its abandonment are lies designed to keep curious people from discovering the truth. The town wasn't abandoned because of failed business ventures or post-war economic changes. It was abandoned because something inhuman decided that human beings had no right to exist in that place. And that something is still there, waiting in the ruins, perfecting its methods on anyone foolish enough to ignore the warnings. The skull I found in that tree was just the beginning of Albert Petka's story. The rest of him is still scattered through those woods, positioned where Nantinaq left them as a permanent reminder of what happens to humans who refuse to leave when they retold. To become part of that reminder. Story 7. Ghosts of the SS Coldbrook. I heard 43 men screaming my name from inside a ship that had been underwater for 80 years. Their voices echoed through the rusted hull as clearly as if they were standing right beside me, calling out in perfect unison from the depths of their metal tomb. My name is Rick Carpenter, and I am a commercial diver who specializes in salvage operations off the Alaskan coast. What I found aboard the SS Coldbrook changed my understanding of death, and why some souls refuse to accept their fate even when their bodies have been claimed by the sea. The official story says the Coldbrook was a Liberty ship that ran aground during a winter storm in 1943, breaking apart on the rocks near Kodiak Island with all hands lost. The wreck lies in 60 feet of water, too deep for casual exploration but shallow enough for experienced divers to reach. Maritime records list 43 crew members aboard when she went down. Their bodies never recovered from the twisted maze of steel that had been their floating home. But those records are wrong about one crucial detail. The crew never left the ship. I was contracted to survey the wreck for possible salvage value, a routine job that should have taken 3 days to complete. The Coldbrook had been sitting on the bottom for decades, slowly collapsing under the weight of water and time. Most Liberty ships from that era had been picked clean by salvage divers or had deteriorated beyond any commercial value. I expected to find an empty shell filled with silt and marine growth. Instead, I found a perfectly preserved crew still manning their battle stations. The first body I encountered was in the engine room, hunched over controls that had been frozen in place by decades of corrosion. The sailor's uniform hung in tatters, but his skeleton remained positioned as if he had died while trying to restart the engines during the ship's final moments. More disturbing than his presence was his posture, not the relaxed sprawl of someone who had drowned, but the tense crouch of someone still working, still fighting to save his ship. I found them throughout the vessel, 43 skeletons positioned exactly where they would have been during normal operations. The radio operator sat at his station with bony fingers resting on the telegraph key. Gunners remained at their battle stations, eye sockets aimed through rusted gun sights at targets only they could see. The cook stood in the galley, his remains bent over a stove that had been cold for 8 decades. None of them showed signs of having tried to abandon ship. The preservation was impossible according to everything I knew about underwater decomposition. Saltwater and marine organisms should have scattered their bones across the ocean floor years ago. Instead, the skeletons remained articulated and positioned, held in place by forces that had nothing to do with physics or biology. Their uniforms had rotted away, but personal effects remained exactly where they had been worn. Watches still strapped to wrist bones, wedding rings still circling finger bones, dog tags still hanging from rib cages. The ship's log, sealed in the captain's cabin, provided the first clue about what had really happened during the Coldbrook's final voyage. The entries, written in fading ink that somehow remained legible after decades underwater, described a routine cargo run that had turned into something far more sinister. 3 days before the wreck, the crew had begun reporting strange sounds coming from the cargo hold, voices calling out in languages none of them recognized, and the sound of metal being torn apart from the inside. The captain had ordered an inspection of the hold, but the crew sent below had returned in a state of panic, refusing to describe what they had found. The log entries became increasingly erratic, describing crew members who claimed to hear their names being called by voices that seemed to come from inside the ship's hull. Several sailors had reported seeing figures moving through the corridors at night, shadows that walked upright but cast reflections that writhed like smoke. By the time the storm hit, half the crew was on the verge of mutiny, demanding that the ship return to port immediately. The captain had refused, insisting that their cargo was too important to abandon. His final entry, dated the morning of the wreck, consisted of a single line repeated 43 times. "They are all here now." I descended into the cargo hold to investigate what had driven the crew to madness. The space was filled with shipping containers that had been torn open from the inside, their contents scattered across the deck in patterns that suggested desperate struggle. But the cargo manifest made no sense. The containers were supposed to have held medical supplies and ammunition, standard wartime freight for the Pacific Theater. Instead, I found evidence of something much older and more dangerous. Mixed among the scattered supplies were artifacts that predated World War II by centuries. Native American ceremonial objects, carved bone implements, and what appeared to be mummified remains wrapped in rotted cloth. The shipping documents, waterlogged but still readable, revealed that the Coldbrook had been carrying more than military cargo. It had been transporting items confiscated from indigenous burial sites across Alaska, artifacts that the War Department had collected under the guise of national security. The crew had unknowingly become grave robbers, carrying the desecrated remains of shamans and tribal leaders whose burial sites had been destroyed to make room for military installations. The voices they had heard calling from the cargo hold weren't hallucinations. They were the spirits of the dead, demanding the return of their sacred remains and the punishment of those who had disturbed their eternal rest. But the spirits hadn't been content to simply sink the ship. They had claimed the crew as payment for the desecration, binding their souls to the vessel as eternal guardians of the stolen artifacts. The 43 sailors were trapped in a supernatural purgatory, forced to continue their duties aboard a ship that would never reach port, carrying cargo that could never be delivered. I understood then why the crew had never tried to abandon ship when it began to sink. They couldn't leave. The spirits had taken control of their bodies during the final hours, positioning them at their stations and holding them there as the water rose around them. The sailors had drowned at their posts not from dedication to duty, but because they had lost control of their own actions. The most disturbing discovery came when I found the captain's cabin. Unlike the other crew members, Captain Morrison had not died at his station. Instead, his skeleton sat at his desk, positioned as if he were still writing in the ship's log. But the pages in front of him were blank, and his bony fingers held a pencil that had been worn down to nothing by decades of phantom writing. Beside his remains lay a leather pouch containing more stolen artifacts. Carved ivory pieces that seemed to writhe in my diving light, bone needles that pointed toward magnetic north despite being underwater, and a collection of teeth that were too large to have come from any human mouth. The captain had been keeping the most powerful items in his personal possession, trying to maintain control over forces he didn't understand. As I examined the artifacts, the water around me began to warm despite the frigid Alaskan ocean temperature. The ship's metal hull started producing sounds, not the creaking of aged steel under pressure, but distinct voices speaking in urgent, overlapping conversations. I could make out individual words in English, mixed with languages I didn't recognize, all of them asking the same questions over and over again. Where are we? Why can't we leave? When will we reach port? The crew was still there, still conscious, still trying to complete their final voyage even though their ship had been sitting on the ocean floor for 8 decades. They were aware of their situation but trapped by the spiritual forces that had claimed them, unable to understand why their familiar routines never brought them any closer to their destination. I tried to surface immediately, but found that my ascent was being blocked by invisible barriers that prevented me from rising above the ship's deck level. The spirits weren't just haunting the vessel. They were actively preventing anyone from leaving with knowledge of their situation. I was becoming part of their crew, another soul bound to the Coldbrook, this eternal mission. The realization that I might never surface filled me with the same panic the original crew must have felt when they realized their ship was sinking. But panic was exactly what the spirits were counting on. They fed on fear, growing stronger with each terrified thought, using human emotion as fuel to maintain their hold on the physical world. The more afraid I became, the more solid their presence grew, and the harder it became to remember that I had a life outside this rusted tomb. I forced myself to remain calm and think like the experienced diver I was rather than like a victim. The spirits had power over the ship and its immediate surroundings, but they were still bound by certain rules. They could influence perception and emotion, but they couldn't directly control physical objects in the living world. My diving equipment still functioned normally, and the laws of physics still applied outside their spiritual domain. Using controlled breathing techniques and focusing on technical procedures, I managed to break free of their psychological influence long enough to locate an escape route through a breach in the hull that hadn't been there when I had entered the ship. The spirits had been hiding the opening, making me believe I was trapped in a sealed tomb when there were actually multiple ways to reach the surface. As I swam toward open water, I could hear the crew calling after me, their voices no longer angry but pleading. They wanted me to stay, not because they were malicious, but because they were desperately lonely after decades of isolation. The living presence of another human being had been the first relief from their torment that they had experienced since the ship went down. But I couldn't help them by joining them in their supernatural prison. The only way to free the crew of the Coldbrook was to return the stolen artifacts to their proper burial sites, breaking the spiritual bonds that had trapped the sailors in their metal purgatory. That meant surface research, legal battles with government agencies, and years of work to locate the scattered remains of the desecrated burial sites. I'm telling you this story because that work is finally complete. After 3 years of fighting bureaucracy and tracking down archaeological records, the artifacts from the Coldbrook's cargo hold have been returned to the tribal communities from which they were stolen. The spirits of the shamans and their families have been properly honored, and their anger has been appeased through ceremony and restitution. The crew of the SS Coldbrook has finally been released from their duties. Divers who visit the wreck now report that the ship feels different. Still sad, but no longer haunted. The skeletons remain at their stations, but they rest peacefully rather than maintaining their eternal vigil. The voices have fallen silent, and the water around the wreck maintains normal temperature and clarity. If you are planning to explore the waters around Kodiak Island, you can visit the Coldbrook without fear. But remember that the ocean holds more than just sunken ships and lost treasure. It holds the consequences of human actions, the spiritual debts that accumulate when sacred things are treated as commodities. The 43 men who died aboard that Liberty ship weren't just casualties of war. They were victims of a supernatural justice system that demanded payment for crimes their government had committed in their name. Their 8 decades of torment serves as a reminder that some prices are paid long after the original transaction is forgotten. And sometimes, the dead refuse to stay dead until the living make things right. Story 8. Tsunami of Souls. I saw 32 people walking across Valdez Bay at low tide, their feet never touching the water as they moved through empty air where their town used to be. They were still there, 60 years after the tsunami took them, searching for something that sank beneath 40 feet of water on Good Friday, 1964. My name is Michael Santos, and I am a seismic engineer who spent last summer studying the long-term effects of the 1964 Alaska earthquake. What I discovered in the ruins of Old Valdez changed my understanding of natural disasters, and why some tragedies echo through time in ways that science can't explain. The official story says the Good Friday earthquake was the most powerful ever recorded in North America, a magnitude 9.2 monster that lasted 4 minutes and 27 seconds. The ground displacement was so severe that entire towns dropped 20 feet below sea level, and the resulting tsunamis wiped coastal communities off the map. Old Valdez, sitting at the head of a narrow fjord, was completely destroyed when underwater landslides triggered waves that reached heights of over 200 feet. But the earthquake didn't just destroy buildings and kill people. It tore holes in reality itself. I came to Valdez to install new seismic monitoring equipment and study how the 1964 earthquake had permanently altered the landscape. The modern town sits on higher ground, 4 miles from where the original settlement used to be. The old town site is now underwater, visible only during extreme low tides when you can make out the tops of streetlights and building foundations beneath the dark water of the inlet. My first hint that something was wrong came when I checked the tide charts. According to NOAA data, the bay should have been at high tide when I arrived at the old town site. Instead, I found myself walking across exposed mud flats that stretched for hundreds of yards, with the waterline much lower than it should have been. Local fishermen I spoke to claimed the tides had been behaving strangely for decades, following patterns that didn't match any known lunar or seasonal cycles. The exposed seabed revealed the skeletal remains of Old Valdez exactly as it had been frozen in time on March 27, 1964. I could see the layout of streets, the foundations of the school and city hall, even individual sidewalks and fire hydrants. But what struck me most was how pristine everything looked despite 6 decades underwater. The concrete should have been covered in marine growth and eroded by salt water, but instead it looked like the town had been abandoned just yesterday. That is when I started seeing the people. At first, I thought they were other researchers or curious tourists exploring the exposed ruins. Figures in the distance, walking among the building foundations and occasionally bending down to examine something on the ground. But when I tried to approach them, they would fade away like heat mirages, only to reappear in different locations a few minutes later. I set up time-lapse cameras to document the tidal patterns and began reviewing the footage each evening. The results were impossible according to everything I knew about photography and physics. The cameras clearly showed dozens of people moving through the ruins during daylight hours, but they cast no shadows and left no footprints in the soft mud. More disturbing, the figures appeared to be wearing clothing styles from the 1960s, and many seemed to be carrying objects or leading children by the hand. I researched the 1964 disaster and learned that 32 residents of Valdez had been killed when the earthquake triggered the underwater landslides that destroyed their town. Most had died in the initial tsunami, but others had been trapped in collapsing buildings or swept away by subsequent waves. Their bodies had never been recovered, lost somewhere in the chaotic aftermath of North America, this most powerful earthquake. The connection became clear when I compared my photographs to archived pictures of the original Valdez residents. The figures I was seeing matched the faces of people who had died 60 years ago, families who had been shopping downtown when the earthquake hit, children who had been walking home from school, workers who had been at the docks when the first wave arrived. They were still there, still going about their daily routines in a town that no longer existed above the waterline. But they weren't just mindlessly repeating their final moments. They were searching for something. I spent days following the ghostly figures, documenting their movements and trying to understand what they were looking for in the ruins of their former home. The pattern that emerged suggested they were conducting some kind of systematic search, checking specific locations and moving in coordinated groups. They would gather at certain intersections, point toward particular buildings, and then spread out to examine different areas before regrouping and moving on. The breakthrough came when I realized they were following the same routes the rescue teams had used in 1964. I found archived emergency response records that showed exactly where search and rescue operations had focused in the hours after the tsunami. The ghostly residents were retracing those same paths, but in reverse, as if they were trying to guide rescuers to locations that had been missed during the original search efforts. I followed one group of spirits to a partially collapsed foundation that had once been the town's general store. According to my historical research, the building had been searched multiple times by rescue teams, but they had found no survivors. Yet the ghostly figures kept returning to this specific location, pointing downward and gesturing frantically at something beneath the rubble. Using ground-penetrating radar, I discovered a void space beneath the collapsed floor that hadn't been detected by the 1964 rescue teams. The cavity was large enough to have sheltered several people, and contained what appeared to be metal objects that could have been personal belongings or emergency supplies. More importantly, the void showed signs of having been deliberately sealed from the inside, suggesting that survivors had taken refuge there during the disaster. I realized that some residents of Old Valdez hadn't died in the initial tsunami. They had survived by taking shelter in basements and reinforced buildings, only to be trapped when subsequent waves buried the town under tons of mud and debris. The rescue teams had given up their search too early, not knowing that people were still alive beneath the ruins, slowly dying from lack of air and water while rescue operations continued overhead. The spirits I had been seeing weren't just the ghosts of tsunami victims. They were the souls of people who had survived the initial disaster but had been abandoned by the living, left to die slow deaths in underground tombs while their families assumed they had been swept away by the waves. For 60 years, they had been trying to show rescuers where to look, pointing to the locations where their bodies still waited to be found. The psychological weight of this discovery was overwhelming. These weren't just historical casualties. They were people who had died calling for help that never came, trapped in spaces where they could hear rescue teams working overhead but couldn't to make themselves heard through the debris. Their spirits were still trying to complete the rescue that had been abandoned decades ago, still believing that someone would eventually understand their desperate signals and dig them out. I contacted modern emergency response teams and convinced them to excavate the locations where the spirits had been pointing. The first dig revealed exactly what I had expected: the remains of 3 Valdez residents who had taken shelter in the general store's basement when the earthquake hit. They had survived the initial tsunami but had been trapped when the building collapsed, slowly suffocating in an air pocket that had kept them alive for days after the disaster. More excavations followed, guided by the ghostly figures who seemed to grow more solid and visible as their messages were finally understood. We found survivors, shelters beneath the school, the church, and several residential buildings. Spaces where people had waited for rescue that never came, leaving behind evidence of their final days in the form of scratched messages on walls and carefully rationed food supplies. Each discovery brought a sense of peace to the corresponding spirits. As their remains were recovered and properly buried, the ghostly figures would fade away with what looked like expressions of relief and gratitude. The supernatural activity at the old town site began to diminish as the forgotten victims of the 1964 disaster were finally acknowledged and honored. But the most important discovery came last, in the basement of what had been the town's emergency shelter. There we found evidence that some residents had survived much longer than anyone had imagined. Weeks rather than days, organized into a small community that had maintained hope even as their situation became desperate. Their final messages, carved into the concrete walls, weren't pleas for rescue but expressions of love for family members and forgiveness for the rescue teams who had given up searching. I realized that the 1964 Good Friday earthquake hadn't just been a natural disaster. It had been a test of human compassion and persistence, a challenge that the living had failed by abandoning their search too early. The spirits of Old Valdez had spent 60 years trying to teach us that no one should be left behind, that every life has value worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most important rescues are the ones that come decades too late. The supernatural activity at the old town site has now ceased completely. The tides follow normal patterns, and the exposed ruins show no sign of ghostly inhabitants. The 32 spirits have finally found the peace that was denied to them by the circumstances of their deaths and the limitations of 1964 rescue technology. But their message remains relevant today. Every time we face a natural disaster, every time we have to decide how long to keep searching for survivors, we reconfronting the same moral challenge that the people of Valdez faced 60 years ago. How much effort is enough? When do we stop looking? How do we live with the knowledge that someone might still be waiting for help that we decided not to provide? The tsunami of souls that haunted old Valdez for 6 decades serves as a reminder that the dead don't to always stay buried, especially when they died believing that the living had given up on them too soon. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for the victims of disasters isn't to prevent future tragedies, but to go back and finish the rescue work that was left incomplete. Because some people are still waiting to be found, even decades after we stopped looking for them. Story 9. Tundra Anupia Vampire. I should have never taken that job in Kodiak. But when you owe $60,000 in student loans and your engineering career has flatlined, you take what you can get. Even if it means spending 3 months on the north slope of Alaska, maintaining drilling equipment in a place where the sun disappears for 65 days straight. The recruiter never mentioned the dreams. They started my second week there. Always the same. I would be walking across the frozen tundra, the aurora borealis painting the sky in sickly greens and purples, when I would hear footsteps behind me. Not normal footsteps, something that started human, then changed mid-stride into something else. Something that crunched through the snow with too many joints, too many angles. I would turn around, and there would be nothing but endless white stretching to the horizon. But the footprints in the snow told a different story. The local Anupia workers avoided me after the first month. I caught them whispering in their native language whenever I walked by, their faces hard with something that looked like fear. Or maybe pity. Thomas Kankuk, the site supervisor who had worked these fields for 20 years, finally pulled me aside during a blizzard that kept us trapped in the main building for 3 days. His weathered face was grave when he spoke. The wind outside howled like something alive and angry, rattling the reinforced windows until I thought they might shatter. Thomas told me about the Turngates, the shapeshifter, the thing that walked the tundra during the polar night, hunting for those who wandered too far from the light. I laughed it off. Had to. I was a rational man with a mechanical engineering degree from Ohio State. I dealt in facts, in measurable forces and predictable outcomes. Not ghost stories, but Thomas wasn't laughing. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and told me what happened to the last maintenance engineer. A guy named Robert Chen from San Diego, just like me, just trying to pay off his debts and start over. They found Robert 3 miles from camp, frozen solid in the snow. But here's what made no sense. His body was completely drained of blood, yet there was not a drop of red anywhere on the pristine white around him. The official report listed exposure as the cause of death. The unofficial story, the one the Inupiat elders whispered around their fires, was different. Robert had been fed upon. The thing about the polar night in northern Alaska is how it messes with your mind. When the sun disappears in mid-November and does not return until late January, your circadian rhythms collapse. Sleep becomes impossible to regulate. Reality starts to blur at the edges. The pharmaceutical company had given us all these industrial-strength vitamin D supplements and light therapy lamps, but nothing really prepares you for that kind of absolute darkness. By December, I was barely sleeping 2 hours at a stretch. The dreams were getting worse, more vivid. In them, I could smell something on the wind, something rotten and sweet, like meat left out too long in summer heat. Impossible, of course, since the temperature never got above -20. But the smell lingered even after I woke up. That is when I started seeing the tracks. They appeared overnight, circling our compound in perfect spirals that grew tighter with each pass. Animal control said they were caribou prints, maybe a confused polar bear. But I had seen caribou tracks. These were different. They started normal enough, but every few feet they would change. The hooves would elongate, separate into something that looked almost like fingers. Human fingers, if humans had fingers that were 8 inches long and ended in points. I measured them. I photographed them. I documented everything with the obsessive precision that had made me a good engineer. The tracks were always exactly 43 inches apart, which meant whatever was making them had a stride longer than any human could manage. The depth indicated something heavy, maybe 300 pounds, but the pattern was wrong for any animal I could identify. They were too deliberate, too intelligent. On December 15th, exactly 2 months into my contract, I discovered something that made my blood freeze in ways the Arctic wind never could. I was doing routine maintenance on the drilling platform, checking hydraulic lines and pressure gauges, when I found claw marks scored deep into the steel housing. Fresh marks that had not been there the day before. The metal was scored in groups of 4 parallel lines, each cut so deep it had gone through the industrial coating and into the structural steel beneath. No animal could do that. No tool in our equipment shed could make marks like those. I ran my fingers along the gouges, and they were still warm. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying in my assigned quarters, I moved into the main operations center where the security cameras and motion sensors were monitored around the clock. I told myself it was because the heating system was more reliable there. I told myself a lot of things that winter, but the real reason was that I was terrified of being alone. The operations center had a wall of monitors showing feeds from 37 cameras positioned around the compound. Infrared sensors, motion detectors, the works. If anything larger than an Arctic fox moved within a quarter-mile of our perimeter, we would know about it. I spent hours watching those screens, looking for movement in the endless white landscape. Most nights, nothing happened. The tundra stretched out like a frozen ocean, broken only by the occasional drift of snow or the distant flicker of the aurora borealis. But on December 20th, something changed. I was watching camera number 12, positioned on the northern approach to the compound, when I saw it. A dark shape moving across the snow, too far away to make out details but clearly heading in our direction. I switched to the infrared feed, expecting to see the heat signature of a caribou or maybe a lost Arctic fox. The screen showed nothing, no heat signature at all, but the shape in the visible light camera was still there, still moving, leaving those same impossible tracks in the snow. I called Thomas on the radio. He arrived within 10 minutes, his face grim as he studied the monitors. We watched together as the thing circled our compound, always staying just at the edge of camera range, never quite close enough to see clearly but never far enough away to ignore. Thomas started speaking in Inupiaq, words that sounded like prayers or maybe warnings. When he switched back to English, his voice was tight with something I had never heard before. Fear. He told me the old stories then. Stories his grandmother had told him, and her grandmother before that. Stories about the Turned Gate, the shapeshifter that walked the tundra when the long dark came. It could take any form it wanted, but its favorite was something almost human. Something that looked right from a distance but became wrong, terribly wrong, when you got close enough to see the details. The Turned Gate fed on blood, but not like any normal predator. It drained its prey completely, leaving behind empty husks that looked like they had aged decades in minutes. And it was smart, patient. It would stalk its chosen victim for weeks, learning their habits, their fears, their weaknesses. Thomas pointed at the monitor where the dark shape continued its slow circuit around our compound. It had chosen me. The next morning, I found my quarters destroyed. Not ransacked like a break-in, destroyed with surgical precision. My bed had been shredded, the mattress torn apart in those same four-line patterns I had found on the drilling equipment. My clothes were scattered around the room, but only certain items. My winter coat, my boots, my heavy gloves, everything I would need to survive outside. The message was clear. It wanted me to come out. It wanted me vulnerable. I moved everything I owned into the operations center and barricaded the door with filing cabinets and equipment racks. Thomas brought me food and water, but he refused to stay after dark. Even he, who had lived his entire life in this harsh landscape, would not spend a night in the same building where the Turned Gate had marked its territory. For 3 days, I lived like a prisoner in my own workplace. I monitored the cameras obsessively, documenting every sighting, every track, every sign of the thing that stalked me. The pattern was becoming clear. It was getting bolder, closer. The circles were tightening. On December 23rd, I made a discovery that turned my understanding of everything upside down. I was reviewing older security footage, going back weeks to try to understand when this had all started, when I found something impossible. In a feed from November 8th, 2 weeks before I had started having the dreams, I saw myself walking across the tundra toward the drilling platform. Nothing unusual about that. I made that walk every day as part of my routine maintenance checks. But as I watched, my figure on the screen stopped walking. It turned to look directly at the camera, even though there was no way I could have known where the camera was positioned. It was hidden inside a weather monitoring station, disguised to look like standard equipment. The figure on the screen smiled. But it was not my smile. The proportions were wrong. Too wide, too many teeth. Then it waved. I had no memory of this moment. None at all. I fast-forwarded through more footage. And there it was again. November 12th, November 16th, November 21st. Always me, but not me. Doing things I had never done. Going places I had never been. Smiling that horrible, too wide smile at cameras I did not even know existed. The thing had been wearing my face for weeks. But if it could look like me, perfectly enough to fool security cameras, then what was I looking at in those other feeds? The dark shape circling the compound, the thing I had been tracking and documenting so carefully. What if that was me? The real me? What if I was the one outside, looking in? I ran to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face looked back at me, familiar and normal. But mirrors can lie. Security cameras are harder to fool. I positioned myself in front of camera number 7 and watched my image on the monitor. For a long moment, everything looked normal. Then I smiled. On the screen, something else smiled back. The face was mine, but stretched and distorted like putty. The eyes were black holes that seemed to go on forever. The mouth opened too wide, revealing rows of teeth that looked more like icicles than anything that belonged in a human skull. I was not me. I had not been me for weeks. But if I was not me, then where was the real me? The answer came with a sound that made my bones ache. A tapping at the reinforced window of the operations center. Slow, deliberate, patient. I turned toward the sound and saw my own face pressed against the glass. My real face, blue with cold, eyes wide with terror and pleading. The real me was outside, had been outside this whole time, watching as something else lived my life. The thing outside mouthed a single word. Help. Then it was gone, leaving only a handprint on the frosted glass. A handprint with fingers that were 8 inches long and ended in points. I looked down at my own hands. My fingers were normal, human, but when I pressed them against the glass where the handprint was, they matched exactly. I understood then what Thomas had tried to tell me. The Turngate did not just feed on blood. It fed on identity, on life itself. It would hollow out its victims slowly, wearing their face, living their memories, until nothing was left but an empty shell wandering the tundra. The real question was not what had happened to me. The real question was how long I had left before the process was complete. Outside, the aurora borealis painted the sky in colors that hurt to look at. The polar night stretched on, endless and hungry. And somewhere in the darkness, something that looked exactly like me was learning to be human. I am still here, in this operations center, watching the cameras and writing this account. But I can feel myself fading, becoming less real with each passing hour. My memories are starting to blur at the edges. I cannot remember my mother's maiden name. I cannot remember what my apartment in Cleveland looked like, but I remember the cold. I remember the hunger. I remember the taste of blood on snow. The thing wearing my face is back at work tomorrow. It will finish my contract, collect my paycheck, and fly back to Ohio. It will live my life better than I ever did. And I will walk the tundra forever, leaving impossible tracks in the snow, waiting for the next engineer who thinks he can outsmart the darkness. The Turngate is patient. It has all the time in the world. But if you are listening to this, if you have found this recording somehow, remember what Thomas told me. Stay in the light. Trust your cameras more than your mirrors. And if you ever find yourself working a winter job in a place where the sun does not shine, pay attention to your dreams. They might be the only real thing you have left. Story 10. Lost Patrol. The vanished Mounties. I found the bodies 73 years too late. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, which is never a good sign when you work for the Canadian Park Service. A helicopter pilot named Jake Morrison had spotted something unusual during a routine survey flight over the Yukon wilderness. Something that looked like fabric fluttering in the wind, bright red against the endless white of the frozen landscape. Red fabric that should not have existed in one of the most remote corners of North America. I grabbed my gear and flew out that same morning. The coordinates Jake gave me placed the discovery about 40 miles northeast of Dawson City, in a region so isolated that most maps just labeled it as empty space. The kind of place where you could disappear forever and nobody would ever think to look for you. But someone had been looking. For over 7 decades, the Lost Patrol, 4 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers who vanished during a routine winter patrol in December 1911. Inspector Francis Fitzgerald, Constable George Kinney, Constable Richard Taylor, and Special Constable Sam Carter. They left Fort McPherson on December 21st, bound for Dawson City with mail and supplies. The journey should have taken 3 weeks. They never arrived. Search parties combed thousands of square miles of wilderness. The official investigation lasted 18 months and involved over 200 men. They found scattered supplies, abandoned campsites, and conflicting reports from native trappers who claimed to have seen the patrol heading in impossible directions. But they never found the bodies. Until now, The helicopter set me down in a clearing about half a mile from Jake's coordinates. The silence hit me first. Not the peaceful quiet of a winter forest, but something deeper. Something wrong. Even my breathing seemed too loud against the absolute stillness of the snow-covered landscape. I followed Jake's GPS markers through stands of ancient spruce and over frozen streams until I reached a small valley that did not appear on any topographical map I had studied. The trees here were different. Older, twisted into shapes that hurt to look at for too long. And there, scattered across the valley floor like discarded toys, were the remnants of the lost patrol. 4 bodies, perfectly preserved by the brutal Yukon cold, still wearing their distinctive red serge uniforms. They lay in a rough circle around what had once been a campfire, as if they had simply laid down to sleep and never woken up. But sleep does not explain the expressions frozen on their faces. Pure, absolute terror. I have seen death before. 23 years with Park Service means you encounter your share of hikers who pushed too far, climbers who made fatal mistakes, hunters who became the hunted. Death in the wilderness usually looks peaceful. The cold is a gentle killer. Hypothermia makes you drowsy, confused, then gone. These men died afraid. Inspector Fitzgerald lay closest to the dead fire, his service revolver clutched in his right hand with 2 rounds missing from the cylinder. Constable Kinney had his rifle across his chest. Bolt action worked, but the chamber empty. The other 2 were positioned like sentries, facing outward from the camp as if watching for something approaching from the darkness. Their personal effects were scattered around the campsite in a pattern that made no sense. Maps torn to shreds and weighted down with stones, as if someone had been trying to destroy evidence of where they had been. Food supplies emptied and arranged in strange geometric patterns, and their patrol log, the official record they were required to maintain, had pages missing. Not torn out, surgically removed with a blade, but it was the tracks that made my hands shake as I photographed the scene. Dozens of them, circling the campsite in concentric rings, pressed deep into snow that should have melted and reformed countless times over the past 73 years. Human footprints, but wrong in ways that took me several minutes to identify. They were all left feet. Every single track was a left boot, size 11 or 12, pressed deep into the frozen ground. No right footprints anywhere, as if something had been walking in circles around the dead officers, hopping on one leg for hours or days. Or as if there had been dozens of identical figures, all missing their right feet. I spent 6 hours documenting everything before the weather started to turn. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour, and the wind began to carry sounds that did not belong in an empty forest. Voices, maybe, or something trying very hard to sound like voices. That night, back in my hotel room in Dawson City, I started researching everything I could find about the Lost Patrol. The official reports were maddeningly vague, full of bureaucratic language that obscured more than it revealed. But I found something else in the local newspaper archives. Stories that had been buried. 3 weeks after the patrol vanished, trappers reported seeing lights moving through the forest at night. Not campfires or lanterns, but something that pulsed and shifted like a living thing. Native elders spoke of something called the hungry spirits, entities that wandered the winter wilderness looking for lost souls to claim. But the story that made my blood run cold appeared in the January 15th edition of the Klondike Nugget newspaper, buried on page 7 between advertisements for patent medicines and winter supplies. A trapper named Michel Boudreau claimed to have encountered 4 mounted police officers on January 3rd, 2 weeks after they were supposed to have reached Dawson City. He described their condition as strange and wrong somehow, noting that they moved in perfect synchronization and never seemed to blink. When Boudreau tried to approach them, they scattered into the forest with inhuman speed, leaving behind only the smell of something rotten and the sound of laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The newspaper dismissed it as the hallucination of a man too long alone in the wilderness. But Michel Boudreau was no greenhorn. He had spent 15 years trapping in the Yukon and knew the difference between reality and isolation madness. More importantly, he had been found dead in his cabin 3 days after the story was published, apparently having frozen to death despite a roaring fire in his stove and enough wood stacked to last through spring. I returned to the site the next morning with more equipment and a growing sense that I was missing something crucial. The bodies were exactly as I had left them, but the tracks had changed. Not disappeared, but multiplied. Now there were hundreds of them, covering every inch of the valley floor in overlapping spirals and figure-8 patterns. All left feet, all the same size, all pressed into snow that should not have held impressions for more than a few hours. I set up my cameras and GPS equipment, trying to map the pattern of tracks, when I noticed something that made me stop breathing for a full 10 seconds. 4 of the newer tracks, pressed into the snow less than 12 inches from Inspector Fitzgerald's body, were still warm. Not melted, warm, as if someone had stepped there moments before I arrived. I followed the warm tracks as they led away from the campsite, through the twisted trees and up a slope that overlooked the valley. They ended at a granite outcropping that jutted from the hillside like a broken tooth. Carved into the stone, worn smooth by decades of weather but still clearly visible, was a message in block letters. They were not alone. Below it, carved in a different hand with different tools, was a date. December 23, 1911. And below that, in letters so fresh they still held rock dust in their grooves, was another date. Today, this date. I backed away from the outcropping so fast I nearly fell down the slope. My rational mind was screaming explanations. Another researcher had been here. A hoaxer, someone playing an elaborate prank. But my instincts, honed by 2 decades in the wilderness, were telling me something else entirely. I was not alone in this valley. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of camping near the site like I had originally planned, I flew back to Dawson City and spent hours in the local museum, digging through their archives of newspaper clippings and historical documents. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about the Lost Patrol. Hidden in a file marked unsubstantiated reports, I discovered dozens of witness statements that had never made it into the official investigation. Trappers, prospectors, and native hunters all describing encounters with 4 figures in red uniforms wandering the wilderness throughout the winter of 1911 and 1912. But the encounters continued long after the search was called off. 1996. Every few years, someone would report seeing 4 Mounties walking through the forest in perfect formation, their faces pale and their eyes reflecting light like animals. Always in winter, always in the same general area where I had found the bodies, and always followed, within days or weeks, by the mysterious death of whoever had reported the sighting. The pattern was consistent across 7 decades. Heart attacks in healthy 30-year-olds, accidents that defied probability, disappearances that made no sense. As if something was silencing witnesses. I was still reading when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number, but when I answered, there was only silence. Not dead air, but the kind of silence that feels occupied. Someone breathing just quietly enough to avoid detection. After 30 seconds, the line went dead. 5 minutes later, it rang again. Same number, same breathing silence. This continued every 5 minutes for 2 hours. I turned off the phone and tried to focus on the documents, but concentration was impossible. Every sound in the hotel became amplified. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, the whistle of wind through the old building, its gaps and cracks. And something else, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. The sound was coming from my window. I lived on the 3rd floor. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there but darkness and the reflection of my own terrified face. But the condensation on the glass told a different story. 4 handprints, pressed against the outside of the window from what should have been empty air. Handprints that were ice cold to the touch when I placed my palm against them. I packed my gear and checked out of the hotel that night, driving south toward Whitehorse with my headlights cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than it should have been. The radio picked up nothing but static, and my GPS kept losing signal despite the clear sky above. 60 miles out of Dawson City, I saw them. 4 figures standing beside the highway, perfectly spaced and motionless in the beam of my headlights. Red uniforms stark against the snow, faces that were human-shaped but wrong in ways I could not articulate. I slammed on the brakes, and the truck slid to a stop less than 20 feet from where they stood. They did not move, did not react, just stood there watching me with eyes that reflected my headlights like mirrors. Then, in perfect unison, they turned and walked into the forest. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, engine running and hands shaking on the steering wheel, before I found the courage to continue driving. When I finally reached Whitehorse, I went straight to the RCMP detachment and filed a report that I knew they would never believe. But I had to try. The investigating officer was professional but skeptical. He took my statement, looked at my photographs, and promised to send a team to verify my findings. I never heard from him again, despite multiple follow-up calls. 2 weeks later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Whitehorse Star, dated 3 days after my visit to the detachment. The headline read, "RCMP officer dies in freak accident." The article described how Staff Sergeant William Morrison had been found dead in his patrol car on a routine highway check, apparently having succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning despite the vehicle being in perfect working condition with no exhaust leaks. Morrison was the officer who had taken my statement. I quit Park Service the next week and moved to Vancouver, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the Yukon wilderness. For 6 months, I told myself I had done the right thing, that some mysteries are better left unsolved. But the dream started in July. Always the same. I am standing in that valley, surrounded by twisted trees and impossible snow. The 4 bodies are gone, but I can hear them moving through the forest. The sound of boots crunching through snow, but only left boots, always only left boots. They are looking for me. They know I found their secret, and they want it back. In the dreams, I run. Through the trees, up the slope, past the granite outcropping with its carved warnings. But no matter how fast I run, the sound of their pursuit never fades. One left foot after another, following me through a landscape that grows stranger and more wrong with each step. And sometimes, just before I wake up, I catch a glimpse of them through the trees. 4 figures in red uniforms, their faces pale as winter moonlight, their eyes reflecting a light that has no source. They are not angry, they are not malevolent, they are simply doing their job, the same job they have been doing for over a century. Patrolling, protecting, making sure that some secrets stay buried in the frozen wilderness where they belong. The Lost Patrol was never lost. They found exactly what they were looking for. And now they have found me. Story 11. Abandoned Hospital of Gnome. The frozen body in the basement morgue was still breathing. I work as a structural engineer for the state of Alaska, and my job takes me to places most people never see. Ghost towns, abandoned military bases, buildings that time forgot, but nothing prepared me for what I found in Gnome's old hospital. The city hired me to assess the building before demolition. Built in 1912 during the gold rush, it had served the community until 1994 when they moved operations to a modern facility. The old hospital had been sitting empty ever since, slowly rotting in the Alaskan wilderness. Gnome is not a welcoming place in March. The temperature hovers around -20, and the wind cuts through your bones like razor wire. But the inside of that hospital was worse than the Arctic cold outside. The moment I stepped through the front entrance, my breath came out in visible puffs despite my heavy winter gear. The building was somehow colder inside than out. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing corridors lined with peeling wallpaper and broken glass. Water damage had warped the wooden floors, and black mold crept up the walls like reaching fingers. But it was the smell that hit me first, not the musty odor you would expect from decades of abandonment. This was different. Medical. Antiseptic mixed with something organic and rotten, like a hospital that was still in use. I started my inspection on the ground floor. Patient rooms stretched down both sides of the main hallway, their doors hanging open like screaming mouths. Inside each room, rusted bed frames sat covered in dust and debris. But someone had been there recently. Footprints in the grime, fresh scratches on the walls. And in one room, I found something that made my blood freeze. A patient chart dated 3 weeks ago. The handwriting was old-fashioned, like a doctor from the 1920s. The patient name was listed as unknown male, gold rush victim. The symptoms described were consistent with hypothermia and starvation, but the treatment notes made no sense. They mentioned procedures that did not exist in modern medicine, remedies involving ice and darkness, and something called perpetual preservation therapy. I photographed the chart and moved to the second floor. This level housed the surgical suites and recovery wards. Here, the temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in thick clouds, and frost began forming on my equipment. The operating theaters still contained their original tables, now covered in rust stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. But it was in the children's ward that I first heard the voices. Soft whispers echoing from empty rooms. Words I could not quite make out, spoken in accents that sounded foreign and old. I followed the sounds down the hallway, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. The whispers grew clearer as I approached room 237. Inside, 20 small beds lined the walls. Children, beds, and sitting on each mattress was a collection of toys. Old toys from the early 1900s. Wooden dolls with painted faces. Tin soldiers with their paint worn away. Rocking horses carved from driftwood. The toys were arranged as if children had just finished playing with them. I checked my notes. According to the hospital records, Room 237 had been the isolation ward during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Dozens of children had died in this room. Their bodies were buried in the town cemetery, but their belongings had apparently never been removed. That was when I noticed the temperature gauge clipped to my jacket. The reading showed -47 degrees Fahrenheit. Impossible. No building could maintain that temperature without active refrigeration. And yet the cold was so intense that ice crystals were forming on the inside of the windows. I needed to get to the basement and finish my inspection quickly. The stairwell down to the lower level was the darkest place I had ever been. My flashlight seemed to lose power with every step, its beam growing weaker and more yellow. The walls were different here. Not the original wood and plaster construction, but something older. Stone blocks that looked hand-carved, like they predated the hospital by decades. The basement had been expanded beyond the building, its footprint. Tunnels carved directly into the permafrost stretched in multiple directions. My blueprints showed none of this. According to the city records, the basement was simply a storage area and morgue. But what I found was an underground complex that seemed to go on forever. The first tunnel led to what had once been the hospital morgue. Refrigeration units lined both walls, their metal doors standing open like empty graves. Most were empty, filled only with ice and shadows. But 3 units still contained bodies. The preservation was perfect, too perfect. These were not the dried husks you would expect after decades of storage. The bodies looked fresh, alive. Their skin had a translucent quality, like ice made from flesh. And their eyes were open. I approached the first body. The tag around its ankle read, John Morrison, Gold Prospector, died March 15, 1918. But as I leaned closer to read the smaller text, the body, his chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. It was breathing. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the morgue. The other 2 bodies were also breathing. Their chests moved in perfect unison, as if controlled by some shared respiratory system. And their eyes tracked my movement across the room. The second tunnel led deeper into the complex. Here, I found the source of the hospital, this impossible coldness. Carved into the permafrost was a natural ice cave that stretched far beneath the building. The walls were lined with hundreds of alcoves, each one containing a perfectly preserved human body. Gold rush miners, Spanish flu victims, native Alaskans, men, women, and children from across a century of Gnome history. All of them breathing, all of them watching, but it was the third tunnel that revealed the truth. This passage led to a circular chamber carved directly from the ice. In the center stood an ornate surgical table made from carved whalebone. Around the edges of the room, medical equipment from different eras sat on stone shelves. Scalpels from the 1800s. Syringes from the 1950s. Modern IV bags filled with some kind of clear fluid. And pinned to the ice walls were hundreds of medical charts. Patient records spanning from 1898 to last week. Each one documented the same experimental procedure. Something called cryogenic life suspension protocol. The charts described a process developed by the hospital, its original chief surgeon, Dr. Elias Frost. During the 1918 pandemic, as patients died faster than they could be buried, Dr. Frost had discovered something remarkable. The extreme cold of the Alaskan permafrost could preserve human life at the very edge of death. Not alive, but not truly dead either. Suspended, waiting. According to the charts, Dr. Frost had perfected the technique over decades. He could keep patients in a state of perpetual near death, their bodies preserved by the cold while their minds remained partially conscious. The procedure required specific conditions: underground ice chambers, temperatures below -40, and regular infusions of a chemical compound derived from Arctic plant life. The final chart in the collection was dated yesterday. My name was written at the top. I ran through those tunnels faster than I had ever moved in my life. Behind me, I could hear sounds that will haunt me forever. The scraping of feet on ice, the whisper of bodies moving after decades of stillness, and underneath it all, a voice calling my name in a tone that sounded medical. Professional, eager. Dr. Frost was still practicing medicine. I burst through the hospital, this front entrance, and into the Alaskan night. My truck started on the first try, and I drove straight to the Gnome police station. But when I tried to explain what I had found, the desk sergeant just smiled and nodded politely. He told me the hospital had been demolished 5 years ago. Said there was nothing but an empty lot where I claimed to have been working. Suggested I might be suffering from cabin fever or altitude sickness. But I have the photographs. I have the medical charts. And I have the business card that was tucked under my windshield wiper when I returned to my truck. Dr. Elias Frost, Chief of Medicine, Gnome Community Hospital, specializing in life extension therapy and Arctic medical research. The card is printed on paper that feels like ice. Yesterday, I received an official letter from the city of Gnome. They want me to return and complete a structural assessment on their old hospital building. They claim there was a mistake in their records. The building was never demolished. It is still standing, waiting for my professional evaluation. The letter is signed by the mayor, but I recognize the handwriting. It matches the medical charts perfectly. Old-fashioned cursive that belongs to a doctor from the 1920s. Dr. Frost is still practicing, still experimenting, still looking for new patients to preserve in his underground kingdom of ice and shadows. And somehow, he knows that I have seen too much to simply walk away. The temperature in my hotel room has been dropping every day. This morning, I woke up with frost on my pillow. My breath comes out in visible clouds even with the heater running full blast. And when I look in the mirror, my skin has started to take on that translucent quality I saw in the morgue. I think the process has already begun. If you ever find yourself in Gnome, Alaska, stay away from the old hospital district. Do not trust any official requests to inspect abandoned buildings. And if you see a business card for Dr. Elias Frost, run. Because the good doctor is always looking for new patients. And his waiting room has been empty for far too long. The last whisper fades, but the cold lingers. If you felt the dark tonight, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story waits just beyond the ice. Tell us where you're listening from or share your own strange encounter. Your words feed the fire here at Midnight Whispers. Alaska's night is long, and our stories are longer. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your footsteps soft.